It's amazing. It's not only in the UK media. If you look at the US press, the delight, the gloating over China's purported difficulties fill the pages. And this recent issue of Foreign Affairs, which is the publication of the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, just across the park from where I am, and is the kind of center of the American establishment, is just filled with end of China stories. Of course, a few months ago it was China about to take over everything stories. This is an elite that talks to itself in circles and with utter confusion, but also a lot of dissimulation. What's happening with China is, of course, complicated. It's by some measures the world's largest economy, by other measures the second largest economy, but it's big and it's complex, so many things are happening. But one of the things that definitely is happening is the United States is doing everything it can to try to derail the Chinese economy. It claims, of course, it isn't, but it is. And as you mentioned, we've been through this before. Of course, the whole Cold War non-military side of the US vis-a-vis the Soviet Union was about economic and technological containment. That was the core organizing idea. And that playbook was used, ironically, against America's ally, Japan, in the 1980s. And it's a period I remember well because I started as an assistant professor in economics at Harvard in 1980. And I went on my first visit to Japan in 1981. And I went with a wonderful colleague, Ezra Vogel, who had written a book which was the Japanese bestseller of the time called Japan as Number One. And Japan as Number One was about the surge of Japanese manufacturing, Sony and Toyota and so forth. And it said Japan has developed a lot of remarkable process improvements, just-in-time manufacturing and so forth. And it was now a dominant manufacturing power. And of course, it was not only in consumer electronics, but increasingly in semiconductors and other cutting-edge technologies. And this was a celebratory mood of Japan in the 1980s. And one could watch, and I watched it close up, how American policymakers, wait a minute, this is an ally that's supposed to be subservient to us. Now it's taking our industry. And by the second half of the 1980s, all this American rhetoric and supposed ideology of the liberal order and so forth, of course, was turned on its head. We need to stop Japan. We need to stop Japan's economy, but we can't do it in just those terms. Japan's a bulwark of our power in East Asia, so we have to do it by agreement. And in the late 1980s, the agreement was Japan would stop exporting to the United States, even though it was hyper competitive vis-a-vis the United States. And the Plaza Agreement that you recall rightly was an agreement that Japan would massively overvalue its currency. Kind of a remarkable idea, but the Japanese yen soared in value, but by design. This was a policy of the United States. The US also imposed many export limits on Japan, and these were called voluntary because Japan, as being a part of the US security system, accepted them and said, we won't export to the United States automobiles or semiconductors and so forth. And by the end of the 1980s, Japanese growth had stopped. But it had stopped absolutely because the United States had stopped it. And Japan, in its way, had acceded to that in public. So the public rhetoric was, well, Japan's entering a recession. The behind the scenes, of course, was the United States had engineered the stop of Japan's relentless manufacturing success. And Japan went into a financial crisis because finance is based on extrapolation. So asset prices are based on extrapolating the rapid growth into the future. And when Japan's rapid growth into the future was no longer rapid, then asset prices collapsed. And in 1990, 1991, 1992, we had the so-called bursting of the Japanese bubble. And Japan went into a long and prolonged crisis. And the US policymakers said, well, Japan's aggregate demand is down, meaning it wasn't selling exports anymore. That was the US policy. Japan should increase its consumption and stop bothering us, basically, with the exports. And I had a very interesting and distinct conversation with one of Japan's top economic policymakers in the mid-1990s, who was a friend and very senior, let's just say. And I said, why don't you weaken the currency? You know, your exports have completely stalled. You have a lack of growth. Japan's no longer competitive. And he looked at me and he said, Jeff, the US won't let us do it. Okay, this is clear, it's kind of obvious, but never said. What is said in the history books is Japan had a balance sheet recession. Japan had a bursting of a bubble. But Japan faced geopolitics straight away. And because Japan was under the US thumb, it never publicly complained. Recently, I was in Japan speaking with one of Japan's most knowledgeable, very, very senior policymakers. And we were recounting this episode in agreement of interpretation. And I said something about how in the economics profession, the so-called balance sheet recession view, that this was about finance and Japan's overextension and bubble had taken hold. And watching him roll his eyes at how ridiculous the normal account was extremely entertaining and very telling for me. So to bring us up to date, China is Japanifying. In fact, that's a term that is being widely bandied about. Oh, China has a big debt crisis. China's no longer as competitive as it was. Big surprise. China is this, China's that, all the weaknesses of the Chinese system. But what's happening in a very concerted way since around 2015 is the United States is doing everything it can to derail China's economic growth. The same playbook. The big difference is China's not under the US security thumb. Everything else is the same. So there isn't a Plaza agreement where China agrees to a massive overvaluation of the renminbi, but there was the Trump tariffs, unilateral, absolutely against World Trade Organization precepts, but of course, WTO rules don't matter to the so-called rule-based order, which is whatever the rules that the United States wants is in fact what the rule-based order means. So the US started this process of the old playbook, the Soviet containment playbook, the Japan containment playbook, now with China. And it's doing it through a mix of policies, not with Chinese agreement, but unilateral tariffs, other blockades on the markets, tax cuts and subsidies with the rules of origin for the US side to say you can't produce in the US or can't get the tax breaks unless it's US based, rules to stop China's inward investment into the US, rules to stop US outward investment to China, and most tellingly now, trying to break China's access to high technology. the rhetoric of all of this is, oh, we're not doing anything against China. This is very narrow. This is a high wall on a small yard. And to paraphrase Jake Sullivan, this is completely to play with fire by trying to stop China's growth. And now we see this year, China's overall growth has slowed tremendously. And the most telling factor, the single biggest factor, is not all the things that are said about the debt markets and real estate. The biggest single factor is China's exports to the US and to the European allies are way down this year because the barriers are going way up. And the barriers are the direct barriers, the warnings to US companies. You better friendshore, you better reshore, you better move away from China in your supply chains. We don't want to see you dealing with China right now. And this is having an effect. What's completely fascinating, though, and this week was the mark of it, is China is not Japan. China is not subservient to the United States. China is much bigger than the Japanese economy, both in absolute terms and relative to the US. And arguably, it's larger than the US economy in absolute size, or second to the US economy. But it's got a lot of friends around the world that also don't want the US hegemony in the global system. And that was the, I think, rather remarkable note of this week's BRICS summit, which you've been discussing at length. I think it was actually a rather remarkable summit. Not only are the existing 5 BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, already larger in size than the G7 when measured at international prices or purchasing power prices, but they added 6 more systemically consequential countries. And rather fascinating, because Brazil took its biggest next door neighbor, Argentina, so that really is solidifying the South American base of this anti-US hegemonic response. They brought in, very interestingly, Egypt and Ethiopia, meaning that it's the northeast corner of Africa and the Indian Ocean side. And these are 2 very, very interesting large countries with more than 110 million people each. And then the Gulf region, of course. And remarkably, China's absolutely stupendous diplomatic success, Iran and Saudi Arabia, as well as the Emirates as the remaining 3. So the BRICS agreed to expand by another 400 million people, another 5% or so of the world GDP. The BRICS countries in the expanded form will be significantly larger than the G7. And what was quite fascinating for me as a monetary economist is the amount of focus on really making a complete workaround from the US dollar, because that's the real point that they're saying, given that the US government very unwisely, self-defeatingly, completely armed and militarized the dollar in the last 10 years, so that the currency is not just a settlements account, it's an instrument of hegemony. And now there's this massive counter reaction to that I think is going to be extraordinarily consequential. So in short, we're seeing a replay of this deep American hegemonic impulse, but I think we're seeing it in a way that it can't succeed. And this week may be exactly that historic moment where the U.S. power essentially peaked, and the anti-hegemonic group of nations, which is very large in the world, by the way. It's not just the 5 BRICS or now the 11 with the 6 new members. It's dozens and dozens of countries that do not want to see one country dominate the world system.